When a quiet 9-year-old girl looks up at her math tutor, eyes brimming with unspoken fear after losing her beloved father, the tutor initially assumes it's simply grief over his disappearance. But one small, chilling detail emerges during their lesson, an uneasy revelation that something far darker might be lurking in this child's life. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of compassion, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Chloe Smith woke one chilly autumn morning in a house that no longer felt like her home. The air held that crisp, leaf-scented coolness so typical of the season, but there was no warmth in her mother's eyes as they crossed paths in the hallway. Chloe could barely recall the last time she felt safe. When her father, Carter, first vanished, neighbors brought over homemade casseroles and lemon cakes, co-workers left flowers and sympathy cards, and the local police knocked on doors or set up search parties. The heartbreak of losing a loved one was meant to be shared, but the hush that settled over the Smith house soon felt like a wall closing in. Julia, her mother, became distant and unpredictable. One day, she would forget to make breakfast altogether, and the next, she would slap a plate of toast and jelly in front of Chloe with such force that half of it would land on the table's edge. In those early days, Chloe believed her mother was just lost in her own grief, so she tried not to make trouble. She thought that if she remained quiet and invisible, maybe her mother could find room to heal. Carter had always been the guiding light in their family. He was calm, gentle, the sort of father who came home from work and scooped Chloe into a big hug before even taking off his jacket. He had a smile that turned everyday moments into small celebrations, whether he was walking Chloe to school or reminding Julia to take a break and watch a sunset with him. When he disappeared, Chloe's entire world tilted. Now, in the early hours of that same autumn morning, she stood by the window in the living room, peeking through the curtains at the wet sidewalk and the neighbor's dog running around in circles. She longed for her father's footsteps to appear on the driveway, for him to push open the front door with a sheepish grin, offering some excuse about why he had gone off so suddenly. But the driveway remained empty, and the hush inside the house was broken only by Julia's curt orders. "Chloe, get your shoes on," her mother said from the kitchen, in a tone that was dangerously close to snapping. "We need to go." Chloe slipped on her worn sneakers. She guessed her mother was planning another trip to the store. In the weeks since Carter vanished, Julia had done anything but sit still. Sometimes, she would drive to the grocery store at odd hours, only to return with random items that barely counted as dinner. Other times, she would vanish for hours, coming back with mud on her shoes and no explanation. That morning, however, Julia's mood seemed more forced, as if she were trying to keep a lid on something that threatened to boil over. Chloe followed obediently. She said very little, her eyes flickering with nervous caution each time her mother turned her direction. They drove in silence. Chloe watched the passing scenery of houses, each with neatly trimmed lawns and the occasional inflatable ghost or skeleton for Halloween. Families who lived there felt normal, while her life had turned into a swirl of confusion and fear. She secretly hoped that when she returned home, her father would be waiting, or at least that her mother would not be in one of her dark moods. Later that afternoon, a light rain began to fall. Chloe hovered near the living room, listening for any sign of her mother. Julia had locked herself in the upstairs bedroom for nearly an hour, occasionally yelling something unintelligible when Chloe got too close to the door. What had become a fixture of her life was beginning to take a toll on her. She felt tension coil at the back of her neck whenever she heard footsteps coming down the hall. Even now, she hesitated to watch cartoons or read a storybook, worried that any trivial noise might provoke Julia's anger. When the doorbell rang, Chloe's heart gave a jump. Julia's footsteps thudded overhead, then went quiet, as though she were pausing to decide whether to greet the visitor. Eventually, she made her way downstairs, shooting Chloe a look of warning. The door opened, and standing there with an umbrella and a slight smile was Miss Diana Henderson. She was the new math tutor hired just 2 weeks ago, someone introduced through a neighbor's recommendation. Julia had made a show of telling people, Chloe needs help catching up. She's been so stressed since her father disappeared. But Chloe knew better. She suspected her mother invited the tutor mostly as a way to keep up appearances, to make it seem like she was a caring parent. Whether or not Miss Henderson could see through the charade, Chloe wasn't sure. "Hello, Julia," Miss Henderson said, closing her umbrella. "I hope I'm not too early?" "It's fine," Julia replied stiffly, though her face twitched with an unconvincing smile. "Chloe's in the living room. Go ahead." Without another word, Julia turned and walked up the stairs, leaving Miss Henderson to enter on her own. The tutor stepped inside and noticed Chloe standing almost as if she were a piece of furniture, eyes lowered. Something about the posture and the fresh bruise on Chloe's left wrist made Miss Henderson's stomach clench. She offered a warm greeting, hoping to put the child at ease. Chloe gave a polite nod, carefully avoiding direct eye contact. "Hi, Chloe," Miss Henderson said softly. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," Chloe managed, though her voice trembled with a barely suppressed edge. "I'm okay." Rain pitter-pattered on the roof. The house felt uncomfortably cold. Miss Henderson's gaze flicked around, taking in the worn furniture, the half-empty mugs on the coffee table, the overall sense that no one had bothered cleaning. She could almost taste the tension. In the short time she had been Chloe's tutor, she had learned a few things. Julia rarely stayed in the same room to observe the lessons. Chloe flinched at the slightest unexpected movement, and from day one, there had been bruises on the girl's arms. For the first session, Miss Henderson had chalked it up to playground accidents. But each time she came back, there seemed to be a new mark, a new dark spot around Chloe's wrists, or a faint bruise near her shoulder. None of them looked like normal scrapes from a fall. Miss Henderson gestured for Chloe to join her on the couch. She opened a math textbook and a small workbook. "Let's see how you're doing with multiplication. If you need a break or if you're feeling tired, just let me know, okay?" Chloe nodded, and the session began. At first, it was all about numbers. What's 5 times 6? How many ways can you multiply to get 12? But as time went on, Miss Henderson gently slid in a little slip of paper where she jotted a question. "How do you feel today?" The adult part of her knew she had to proceed with caution. If she tried to question Chloe outright, she might scare her into silence, or worse, spark Julia's wrath. So she pretended these question slips were part of the practice, an exercise in reading and writing. Chloe's eyes skimmed over the note, and after a moment's hesitation, she picked up a pencil. She wrote in small, shaky letters, "Yeah, just a bit tired." Miss Henderson read the note and offered a faint smile, nodding to Chloe as if to say, "Thank you for telling me." She then slipped the note into her pocket. The rest of the session went by without incident, though Miss Henderson noticed Chloe fidgeting with the sleeves of her sweater. The bruises were well hidden now, but Miss Henderson caught a glimpse here and there. At the end of the lesson, Miss Henderson folded her textbooks under her arm and murmured a gentle goodbye. Julia reappeared at the top of the stairs. She forced another polite smile, asked if everything went well, and escorted Miss Henderson to the door. The tutor stepped out into the fading daylight, feeling a cold gust of wind rake across her cheeks. She couldn't shake the image of Chloe's bruises and the haunted look in her eyes. Something was terribly wrong in that house. That evening, Miss Henderson returned home to a small, cozy apartment where her husband, James Henderson, greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. James was a police officer with a methodical mind, quick instincts, and a compassionate heart. He could read tension in people's faces the way some people read street signs, and he caught on immediately that something weighed on his wife's mind. "You look worried," he said, helping her take off her jacket. "Everything okay, Diana?" She sighed, pressing her lips together. It's that little girl I'm tutoring. Chloe Smith. Remember I mentioned her father went missing?" James's expression tightened. "Smith? Carter Smith, right? The missing persons case from about 2 months ago?" "Yes, that one. The mother hired me. And I'm fairly certain Chloe's, well, James, I think she's being abused." With that declaration, the floodgates of her anxiety opened. She explained the bruises, the stiff silence in the house, and the note she had coaxed out of Chloe. James listened intently, his brows furrowed. He told her that from what he recalled, Carter Smith's disappearance had no official sign of foul play. He had simply been listed as missing, and the investigation hadn't progressed. But James agreed that something felt off, especially if the mother was prone to sudden mood swings or violence. He reminded Diana that without concrete evidence, Child Protective Services or the police might not be able to intervene fully. Keep your eyes open, James advised. Document everything you can. I'll look into the father's case again. If something doesn't line up, maybe we'll find cause to dig deeper. Diana appreciated his practical approach, though it left her worried about Chloe's day-to-day safety. Still, the seed was planted. That night, she wrote a few private notes on what she had observed, the times she visited, the bruises. It felt unsettling to keep records on a child's pain, but something told her she might need them soon. Several days later, Diana returned to the Smith house. It was a rainy afternoon, the sky an overcast gray that made the street lamps flicker on early. Julia opened the door and ushered her in, wearing an almost forced politeness, as though hosting a guest she didn't truly want around. Chloe waited in the living room, looking small and listless. Diana took the same spot on the couch as before, and Chloe sat beside her. Out came the math workbook and textbook. They began a simple review of addition and subtraction, but Diana soon slipped another piece of paper into Chloe's workbook. This time she wrote, "Did something else happen this week?" She waited, her heart racing at the thought of what Chloe might reveal. Chloe stared at the slip of paper for a long while. She bit her lip, her eyes darting toward the staircase. Julia was upstairs, presumably in her bedroom, but every so often, the floorboards creaked, making Chloe flinch. Eventually, she lifted her pencil and wrote a single sentence, "I can't sleep." Her letters were wobbly. Diana offered a soft, encouraging nod. She mouthed the words, "Are you okay?" though she did not speak aloud for fear that Julia might overhear. Chloe bowed her head, tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. The mere question seemed to open a small chasm of sorrow. Diana's heart twisted. She ended the session with gentle encouragement, praising Chloe for the math problems she got right. When it was time to leave, Diana said goodbye, glancing at Julia one last time. There was something unnerving about Julia's stare. It was too fixed, too hollow. Diana quickly departed and went straight home to share this latest development with James. That evening, Diana and James hovered in the kitchen, the aroma of a half-cooked meal lingering. But the conversation had taken over. Diana recounted how Chloe admitted she couldn't sleep, and how the bruises seemed to be in different stages of healing, indicating ongoing harm. James rubbed his chin. "You said the mother's name is Julia, correct? Something about her statements in the father's missing case. I remember them being oddly conflicting. Let me see if I can pull that file again. There might be something there." True to his word, James retrieved the basic details of Carter Smith's disappearance. The statements from Julia described how Carter supposedly left the house after a minor disagreement, but she contradicted herself in another interview, claiming they rarely fought. Also peculiar was the mention of a large withdrawal from their joint bank account just days before he vanished. Carter's personal items, laptop, wallet, car, were left behind in ways that made no logical sense if he had simply walked away to start a new life. Still, the police hadn't found any solid evidence of foul play, and so the case grew cold. James read these details aloud to Diana, and each point made her more uneasy. What if she had something to do with his disappearance? Diana asked, voice dropping to a near whisper. And now she's taking her anger out on Chloe. James shook his head, uncertain. If that's the case, it's more serious than I thought. But speculation won't help. We need facts. Over the next week, Diana and James balanced their daily lives with a quiet, growing investigation. Diana continued her tutoring sessions, each time adding subtle questions to Chloe's worksheets. Chloe's answers became more telling. One day, she wrote, "Dad's not coming back, is he?" Another day, "She gets so angry." Diana watched, alarmed, as this small child seemed to be unraveling under the weight of fear. She saw exhaustion in Chloe's eyes, the way she trembled at unexpected noises. Meanwhile, James pored over any detail he could find about Carter's last known whereabouts. He noted that Julia's statements had changed from interview to interview. She had told the police that Carter left around 10 at night, then later claimed it was closer to midnight. There was mention of a neighbor who had heard loud shouting. It all painted a picture of a household under pressure. Yet none of it was proof. He needed something more tangible. Diana felt torn each time she left the Smith house. She dreaded the possibility that Julia might catch on to her subtle inquiries. If Julia suspected that Chloe was confiding in her tutor, would that provoke a harsher response? Diana had nightmares where she arrived for a tutoring session only to find the house empty, with no trace of Chloe. In those dreams, she woke up in a cold sweat, reaching for James in the darkness. One evening, as Diana set out dinner plates, she turned to her husband. "I can't just do nothing anymore. Chloe wrote that she got locked in a closet for a whole night. I have to report this, James. I'm so scared for that girl." James placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll handle it the right way. Let me see if I can push a welfare check. But you know how these things go. If Julia denies it and Chloe's too scared to talk, it might not be enough." Diana's eyes brimmed with tears. "You need to look deeper into Carter's disappearance, James. If you can find any proof that Julia harmed him, that would be the break we need." His gaze was somber. "I'll do everything I can." That night, James stayed up well past midnight, leaning over his desk with a dim lamp illuminating the paperwork. He cross-referenced phone records, looked at credit card statements, and made notes on the potential timeline. He noticed that, shortly after Carter vanished, Julia had visited a remote cabin area. The reason was never explained. He pinned it as a lead to explore. His gut told him there was a strong chance Carter hadn't simply walked off. Something more sinister was at play. Diana, for her part, didn't sleep much either. She lay in bed replaying every tutoring session in her mind, every subtle flinch or bruise on Chloe's skin. She remembered the quiet desperation when Chloe wrote, "Dad's not coming back, is he?" Almost as if the child already knew the truth but was too afraid to voice it. In the early morning hours, Diana resolved that she would try one more tactic, a hidden audio recorder. If she could capture a moment where Julia became abusive, it might be enough to save Chloe from further harm. The next session, Diana arrived at the Smith house wearing a small device concealed in her jacket pocket. She prayed that she wouldn't be discovered. Her heart thudded so loud she almost believed Julia could hear it. This time, Julia didn't even bother with pleasantries. She opened the door and motioned for Diana to go straight to the living room. Her face looked drawn, her cheeks pale, and her eyes seemed colder than usual. "Chloe's waiting," Julia said curtly. Diana nodded, stepping in. She found Chloe seated on the couch, her workbook on her lap. The child managed a faint smile but did not lift her gaze entirely. Diana gently settled beside her, flipping open the pages. "How's my star student today?" she asked softly. "You ready to tackle some math?" Chloe shrugged, pressing her pencil to the page. The session began quietly, with Diana asking about multiplication and Chloe answering in subdued tones. Periodically, Diana glanced around, straining her ears for any sign that Julia was lurking nearby. She heard footsteps overhead, but it was impossible to tell what Julia was up to. After about 20 minutes, Diana slipped another note into Chloe's workbook. "How are you feeling today? Did something happen?" Chloe hesitated for a long moment before writing, "She yells at me every night." The letters were so small that Diana had to lean in close to read them. Her heart clenched. She looked up at Chloe with compassion. "It'll be okay," Diana whispered, so softly it was barely audible. "We're going to help you. I promise." Just then, heavy footfalls sounded on the stairs, and Julia stomped into the living room. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes had a manic edge to them. Diana quickly pulled the workbook onto her lap, hoping to hide the note. Julia's stare flicked between them, as if measuring their expressions. "Everything all right here?" Julia asked, her voice edgy. "Why are you whispering?" Diana forced a smile. "Just encouraging Chloe. She's getting better at her multiplication tables." "Right, Chloe?" Chloe nodded mutely, her eyes fixed on the floor. Julia narrowed her gaze, as though trying to detect a lie. After a moment of tense silence, she released a low huff and said, "Let me know if you need anything," in a tone that implied the opposite. Then she spun on her heel and marched back upstairs. Diana let out a shaky breath. She turned to Chloe, who remained frozen, and gently whispered, "We'll finish up, then I'll leave. But remember, if you ever feel too scared, you can call for help. Do you know how to call 911? Chloe nodded, the pencil trembling in her hand. Diana felt an ache in her chest. She wanted nothing more than to whisk this child away from the looming threat upstairs, but she knew she couldn't do it without legal steps. So she carefully concluded the tutoring session, tidied up, and made an excuse to leave early. Before she left, she gently touched Chloe's hand, a silent gesture of care. That night, when Diana returned home, she found James at the kitchen table, papers spread out everywhere. He looked up, eyes tired but determined. "Diana, you're not going to believe what I found," he said. "There's some surveillance footage from a gas station near the Smith house, dated the night Carter supposedly disappeared. It shows Carter's car driving out of the neighborhood, but the figure behind the wheel is not Carter. The shape of the hair, the shoulders, it looks like Julia." Diana's eyes widened. "You mean she might have taken his car that night and, oh my God, James? If she harmed him—" James held up a hand. "We're not jumping to conclusions yet, but this is huge. And there's more. She was spotted about 40 miles away, near a wooded area. There's evidence of freshly turned soil discovered by a hiker around the same time, but it wasn't investigated because there was no official reason to connect it to Carter's disappearance." Diana's heart pounded. "Do you think it could be?" "It could be," James said, nodding grimly. "I'm going to get a few colleagues on board and see if we can check that area properly. But we'll have to be discreet. If Julia did murder Carter, Chloe is in even more danger than we realized." Diana's knees felt weak. She sank into a chair, pressing a hand to her mouth. "We have to get that little girl out of there. If Julia is that unstable—" "I know," James said, setting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know." The next day, James arranged a quiet meeting with a trusted colleague. They decided to do a covert search of that remote area, while Diana prepared to gather more evidence of abuse. The hidden audio recorder in her jacket had only captured vague footsteps and muffled voices, nothing strong enough to prove child abuse. She decided to try a different tactic. Maybe coaxing a direct confession out of Julia would be too risky, but what if she could record the tension, the threats, the insults? That evening, Diana rummaged through her closet and found a small digital recorder she had once used for an old project. It was more sensitive than the tiny device she had worn previously. She stashed it carefully in her purse, making sure it was fully charged. If an outburst occurred, she hoped it would be enough to capture clear audio. Early the following morning, James left for the remote wooded site with 2 fellow officers who agreed to help. They parked on the edge of a dirt road and hiked in, following the directions from an old tip. The forest was thick, leaf litter covering the ground, branches overhead tangling like spindly arms. James's breath plumed in the chilly air. It took them a while to find a patch of ground that seemed disturbed, but eventually they discovered a shallow area near a fallen log. The soil looked different, as if it had been dug up and then hastily smoothed over. The officers exchanged somber glances. One of them turned to James. "We'll need a forensics team to come out here." James nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah. Let's rope this area off. Keep it quiet for now." The presence of that disturbed soil confirmed his worst suspicions. Carter likely hadn't simply disappeared. If they found a body, they could tie it to Julia. That realization filled James with a surge of urgency. Chloe needed protection, and she needed it fast. While James was in the woods, Diana headed to the Smith house for another tutoring session. Her stomach churned with nerves, especially knowing that her husband might be out there uncovering a body. She arrived at the house, pressed the doorbell, and waited. Julia answered with an irritated glance, letting her in without a word. Chloe was on the couch, wearing a long-sleeved sweater despite the muggy warmth inside. Her wrists were hidden, which made Diana suspect there might be new bruises or marks. "Hey, Chloe," Diana said gently, taking a seat beside her. "How are you today?" Chloe gave a half-hearted shrug. "I'm okay." Diana nodded and opened the workbook, but she kept her purse close, where the recorder was silently running. She asked Chloe about her multiplication tables, but Chloe's responses were almost robotic. Diana slid a piece of scratch paper over and wrote, "Are you hurt?" Chloe stared at the question, tears glistening in her eyes, but said nothing. Instead, she took a breath, opened her mouth, and seemed about to speak out loud. Suddenly, thunderous footsteps shook the stairs. Julia stormed into the living room, her face contorted with anger. She glared at Chloe, then at Diana. "What's going on?" she snapped. "Why is she crying?" Diana's heart pounded. She forced herself to remain calm. "We were just working on a tough problem." Chloe got a bit frustrated. Julia narrowed her eyes and looked at the scratch paper. Chloe flipped it over quickly, but not before Julia's gaze flickered there. For a moment, fear danced across Julia's features, replaced by simmering rage. "You're done for today," she declared. "Chloe's obviously not in the mood." "Don't push her." Diana stood up slowly, her pulse roaring in her ears. "I understand. We can reschedule." Julia motioned her toward the door. Just as they reached the threshold, Julia's voice dropped to a dark whisper. "If you cause trouble," she muttered, eyes flicking dangerously, "it won't end well for either of you." Then she nudged the door open, practically shoving Diana outside. The door slammed shut. Diana walked back to her car, hands trembling. She fumbled for her keys, practically dropping them in her panic. The adrenaline was so intense that she had to pause and take a few deep breaths before starting the engine. Once she was on the road, she reached into her purse and checked the recorder. The small red light was still flashing, indicating it had been recording. She only hoped it had captured Julia's threat clearly. That night, Diana played the recording back with James. They heard the muffled sounds of the tutoring session, Chloe's quiet voice, and then Julia's footsteps. They heard Julia bark, "You're done for today." And near the end, they caught that menacing whisper. The words were faint but distinguishable. "If you cause trouble, it won't end well for either of you." Diana's skin crawled hearing it. It was hardly a full confession of abuse, but it was damning evidence of a threat. "It's enough to prove she's a danger," James said firmly. "Between this and everything else we've documented, we might have enough to intervene." Diana nodded, tears in her eyes. "Please, James. We have to move fast. Chloe is in danger every day she stays in that house." James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're getting close. The forensics team is heading out to that site tomorrow. If they confirm Carter's body is there, we'll have grounds for a murder charge. We'll also be able to remove Chloe from Julia's custody immediately." The following morning, James received the call that forensics had uncovered human remains in a shallow grave at the wooded site. Though it would take time to confirm the identity, the assumption was strong that it was Carter Smith. The officers also found some personal items, like a wallet and a watch. James's heart twisted at the thought of how Chloe would react to the news that her father was truly gone. But it also lit a fire in him. He was prepared to protect Chloe at any cost. Diana, on edge all day, waited anxiously for James to confirm they could act. Finally, that evening, he came home, still in uniform, looking worn out but resolute. "We're getting a warrant," he said, voice grim. "We have enough evidence. Tomorrow morning, we're going in." Though relief flooded Diana, she felt a surge of anxiety, too. She pictured Chloe, perhaps locked in her bedroom or forced to endure some last bit of cruelty from Julia. She prayed they would get there in time. At daybreak, James joined a small team of officers outside the Smith house. Diana stayed behind, pacing their living room and glancing at her phone every few minutes. The official cars quietly lined the street to avoid tipping off Julia. But it didn't take long before neighbors started peering out windows. James and two fellow officers approached the front door. He knocked firmly, calling out, "Police, open up." A tense moment passed. Then the door cracked open to reveal Julia, her hair unkempt, eyes bloodshot. The second she saw the uniforms, her face darkened with panic and anger. "What's going on?" she snapped. "We have a warrant to search the premises," James said. "Step aside, ma'am." Julia tried to block the entrance, launching into a barrage of protests, claiming they had no right and she had done nothing wrong. But the officers pushed past her. Two of them headed upstairs, while James and another officer searched the first floor. Doors were flung open, rooms checked. Finally, one officer yelled down, "I found her up here." Chloe was locked in her bedroom, curled on the bed. Tears streaked her cheeks, and new bruises marred her arms. She clung to the officer who freed her, trembling. Meanwhile, Julia shrieked at James, shouting that she was being framed, that everyone was out to get her. The officers calmly read her the Miranda rights, handcuffing her as she spewed insults. "Chloe," James murmured, kneeling down to the little girl's eye level. "My name is James. You know Miss Henderson, right? She's my wife, and she's very worried about you. We're going to keep you safe, okay?" Chloe nodded, tears still rolling. She looked so small, so terrified, that James wanted nothing more than to shield her from the monstrous behavior they had just witnessed. Another officer carefully guided Chloe out of the house, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Julia continued to screech, twisting in the officer's grip, her voice becoming hoarse. "You have no proof," she raged. "He left. He ran off, and now you're blaming me. Where's your proof?" James's expression remained stoic. He had more than enough proof. The remains discovered in the woods, the financial records, the surveillance footage, and, most damning of all, the new evidence of child abuse. Julia would face a trial for murder and child endangerment at the very least. That afternoon, Diana waited with bated breath at home, only to see James pull up with Chloe in the back seat. The moment Diana spotted the little girl, her eyes misted over. She stepped onto the porch, arms open. Chloe hesitated briefly, then ran into Diana's embrace with a silent sob, burying her face in the woman's shoulder. Diana stroked her hair gently, whispering, "It's going to be okay now. You're safe." Julia was processed at the station, her mug shot taken, and formal charges levied. The entire community buzzed with shock as news broke that Carter's body had been found and that Julia was suspected of his murder. The trial preparations began almost immediately. Chloe was placed under protective custody, and for the time being, Diana and James volunteered to be her temporary guardians. The arrangement was a godsend for Chloe, though the emotional toll was enormous. She struggled with nightmares, sometimes waking up in the middle of the night, crying out for her father. Diana and James tried to give her the most normal routine possible under the circumstances. They fixed her a comfortable bed in their small guest room, stocked the pantry with her favorite cereal, and made sure to keep the environment calm. Still, there was an unspoken heaviness in the air. Chloe had lost so much, and she was still reeling from the shock of seeing her mother arrested. Days turned into weeks as the trial approached. The prosecution worked to piece together every detail of Julia's crime. They believed Carter had confronted her about finances or some other marital issue. Perhaps she worried he would leave her and take Chloe. In a rage, she struck him, then decided to cover it up. The specifics were grim. Each day, more evidence surfaced showing that Julia made that large withdrawal to secure her own future. She had used Carter's car to drive his body out to the remote location, disposing of him there. The timeline matched the surveillance footage, and the forensics matched Carter's remains. For Chloe, the biggest challenge was testifying about the abuse she endured. On the day she appeared in court, she wore a new dress that Diana had bought for her, and she clung to a small teddy bear the judge allowed her to keep on the stand. She was so nervous that her hands shook. The courtroom was packed, with curious townspeople, reporters, and lawyers crowding the benches. Julia sat at the defense table, her face pale and furious. Chloe avoided looking at her mother, focusing instead on the polished wood of the witness stand. The prosecutor guided Chloe through basic questions first: her name, age, school, and how she came to live with Miss Henderson. Chloe spoke in a quiet, trembling voice. Then came the harder questions about what happened at home after her father disappeared. Chloe described how her mother yelled at her, sometimes locked her in a closet, sometimes struck her. Each confession felt like a fresh wound. She admitted that her mother made threatening comments, telling her she would end up like her father if she didn't keep quiet. Throughout the testimony, Diana and James sat in the gallery, hearts aching for the small girl forced to relive her trauma. Julia's defense tried to discredit Chloe, suggesting she was coached or confused. But the evidence was overwhelming. There was the audio recording of Julia's threat, the bruises documented by Diana, the suspicious timeline of Carter's disappearance, and finally, the discovery of Carter's body. Julia's guilt seemed undeniable. When the verdict was read, guilty of murder and child abuse, Julia had a brief, chilling outburst, screaming at the jury that they were wrong, that everyone was lying. The judge ordered her to be removed from the courtroom. Chloe trembled, tears brimming in her eyes, but she clutched her teddy bear tighter. In that moment, it truly sank in. Her mother would never come home again, and her father was gone forever. In the weeks after the trial, Child Protective Services searched for extended family who might take Chloe. There were distant relatives, but none seemed suitable or willing to care for a traumatized 9-year-old. Diana and James had grown attached to Chloe. They saw in her a spirit that, despite everything, still longed for kindness and safety. They made the decision together to apply for permanent guardianship. It was not a simple process, but their dedication, along with the supportive testimony from neighbors and the local police, made a strong case. One evening, as the paperwork was nearly finalized, Diana found Chloe sitting on the couch, staring at a photo of Carter. Her eyes were distant, full of sorrow. Diana settled beside her, gently placing an arm around the child. "You miss him," Diana said softly. Chloe nodded. "He was always so nice. He never yelled at me. Not once. He'd just say, 'Let's figure it out together,' whenever I messed up." Diana felt tears sting her own eyes. "He sounds like a wonderful dad." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioner. Eventually, Chloe turned to face Diana, her brow pinched with worry. "Are you sure you want me here? I mean, I know you and James are nice, but it's probably a lot of trouble." "Chloe," Diana said, her voice firm but caring, "we want you here. We want you to be safe and happy, and to know that there's a place where you're loved. You're not trouble. You're family." For the first time in what seemed like ages, Chloe truly smiled, a small, hopeful curve of her lips. She leaned her head on Diana's shoulder, and they sat in peaceful quiet. Over the next few days, they finished the guardianship process. Chloe slowly adjusted to her new life, a life that offered her more than just fear and uncertainty. She still had nightmares, memories of being locked in the closet, the hateful glare in her mother's eyes, the sound of that door slamming. But she also had moments of light, James teaching her how to ride a bicycle, Diana baking cookies and letting Chloe sprinkle them with sugar, quiet evenings watching family movies. Each day, Chloe felt a little more grounded, a little less haunted. The trauma might never fully vanish, but she was no longer alone. When the guardianship became official, James celebrated by gifting Chloe with a small necklace, a simple silver pendant shaped like a heart. She touched it fondly, amazed that she, who had felt so unwanted, was now the center of two people's loving attention. "Promise me," Chloe whispered to James as he fastened the clasp, "that you won't disappear too." He pressed a hand over hers. "I promise." Diana promises too. "We're here. We're your family." Word of Chloe's new guardianship spread through the community. Neighbors who once dropped off casseroles for Julia and Chloe began stopping by the Henderson home with gifts and well wishes for Chloe's new life. One neighbor even presented Chloe with a photo album of her father from a holiday party years ago. The pictures showed Carter smiling, wearing a cheesy Christmas sweater. Chloe stared at the images for hours, tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were tears of gratitude for the memories. She was finally safe enough to remember her father without being punished for mentioning him. Throughout the transition, Diana continued her tutoring with Chloe, though now under a far happier roof. Chloe's math skills improved significantly. She even developed a small interest in science, particularly astronomy, after James took her to a local planetarium. Every little milestone, solving a tough multiplication problem, riding her bike around the block, laughing at a silly cartoon, became a testament to her resilience. Still, the shadow of her mother's deeds and the heartbreak of losing her father weighed heavily in her quieter moments. Sometimes, in the middle of dinner, she would pause, remembering a time when Carter had been there, and she would fall silent. James or Diana would gently change the subject or reach out to comfort her, letting her know that though the pain remained, she wasn't alone in it. One day after school, Chloe came home excited about a small writing project she had been assigned in class, to pen a short essay on someone who inspired her. She ran into the house, rummaging through her backpack for the assignment sheet. James and Diana were in the kitchen, preparing dinner. "Look, I have to write about someone who is a hero in my life," she announced breathlessly. James smiled, setting down a cutting board. "Sounds fun. Who are you thinking about writing about?" Chloe beamed shyly. "Well, my dad was a hero, but I think I want to write about both of you, too." "Is that allowed? I mean, you guys saved me." Diana's eyes shimmered with emotion. "Chloe, you can write about whoever you want. There's no rule that says it can only be one person." She glanced at James, and they shared a look of pride and tender sadness. Chloe stood a bit taller, as if this idea filled her with confidence. "I want to write about how Dad taught me to never give up, and how you two showed me I'm worth loving." James swallowed hard, turning away to wipe at his eyes. He cleared his throat and said, "I think that sounds perfect, kiddo." Life began to settle into a new kind of normal. Occasionally, lawyers reached out about finalizing details of Julia's conviction, but Chloe wasn't required to attend any more hearings. The wave of media interest in Carter's murder eventually subsided. People moved on to the next big story, though the memory lingered in the town's consciousness as a tragic cautionary tale. Meanwhile, Chloe, Diana, and James carved out a small sanctuary in their home, a safe place that Chloe knew she could rely on. One evening, about a year after Julia's conviction, Chloe curled up on the sofa with a photo of Carter, gazing at his warm smile. The laughter lines around his eyes seemed to invite her to be happy, to embrace life again. James sat beside her, turning on the evening news out of habit. A small segment reported Julia's formal sentencing, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chloe felt an odd mixture of relief and sorrow. There would be no chance for a normal relationship with her mother, but at least the threat was gone. She felt safe to dream of a future, one where her father's memory could live in her heart without overshadowing her present. As time went on, Chloe excelled in her new school. She made a friend named Brianna, a gentle soul who shared her love for art projects. Diana attended parent-teacher conferences, proudly celebrating Chloe's accomplishments, and James taught her self-defense basics in the backyard on weekends, wanting her to feel capable and strong. Step by step, Chloe felt the grip of fear loosen. She found small joys in everyday life: an ice cream cone on a hot day, the feel of sunshine on her skin, the excitement of picking a new library book. Of course, there were moments when the weight of the past returned, like the first holiday season without either parent from her old life. She cried on Christmas Eve, missing Carter's big grin when she opened her presents, but she was comforted by James and Diana, who reminded her that love can be found in new places, too. And so the sadness became manageable, a memory of what she had lost, but no longer a prison. Eventually, after thorough home studies and many interviews, the courts granted Diana and James the right to officially adopt Chloe. It was a day of celebration. Friends from the police station and neighbors who once saw Chloe as a frightened girl now gathered in support. The adoption hearing was brief but emotional. Chloe clung to Diana's hand the entire time, her heart fluttering with both anticipation and relief. When the judge announced that Chloe was now legally their daughter, Chloe let out a trembling laugh, hugging Diana and James with all her might. From that day forward, her last name became Henderson, though she chose to keep Smith as a middle name to honor her father. Chloe Smith Henderson, an identity that woven the love of her dad into the care of her new parents. She walked out of the courthouse with a grin that lit up her face in a way that had once seemed unimaginable. That evening, they celebrated with a simple dinner at home: pasta, garlic bread, and a homemade chocolate cake. Chloe insisted on helping with the cake batter, giggling when some of the chocolate splattered onto her nose. Diana wiped it away, remarking how wonderful it was to see that playful spirit. Afterward, they ate their slices in comfortable peace, no tension in the air, no fear of footsteps on the stairs, no echoes of angry voices. It was a normal family scene, the kind that Chloe had prayed for countless times. Many nights later, as Chloe prepared for bed, she paused in front of a framed photo of Carter displayed on her dresser. She gently ran her fingers along the frame, whispering, "Dad, I think you'd like it here." She smiled, a single tear escaping down her cheek. "Miss you?" She climbed into bed, tucking herself beneath the covers. Diana appeared at the doorway, leaning against the frame with a soft expression. "Good night, sweetheart. Do you want me to read you anything?" Chloe shook her head. "I'm good," she said with a small, content smile. Diana tiptoed over, pressing a gentle kiss to Chloe's forehead. "Sweet dreams." She flicked off the light, leaving a small nightlight shaped like a star glowing in the corner. The soft illumination reminded Chloe of how even a tiny bit of hope could pierce the darkness. In time, Julia's name drifted from Chloe's daily thoughts. The nightmares became rarer, replaced by actual childhood experiences. A sleepover with Brianna, a trip to the zoo, a Christmas morning spent unwrapping presents without dread. On the occasions that people asked about her past, Chloe simply said that her father was gone, and her birth mother was no longer in the picture. She didn't share the darker details. Some wounds she preferred to keep private, trusting that only those she considered family needed to know. Diana and James, for their part, also felt the impact of Chloe's adoption in profound ways. James had always imagined fatherhood, but never quite like this. He found himself swaying between fierce protectiveness and the vulnerability of loving someone who had already been hurt so deeply. Diana, too, discovered that mothering a child with trauma required patience, empathy, and a willingness to confront her own fears. But every step they took, whether it was a tough conversation, a comforting hug in the middle of the night, or a proud applause when Chloe excelled at a school recital, fortified their bond. Sometimes, over the dinner table, they talked about Carter in respectful, tender ways. Chloe would tell them about how he used to make up silly songs while driving her to school, or how he wore mismatched socks on purpose just to see if she'd notice. James and Diana listened closely, savoring each anecdote, recognizing that these memories were stepping stones for Chloe's healing process. They became guardians not just of Chloe, but of Carter's legacy, ensuring that his love lived on in the warmth of their new household. When reporters occasionally tried to revisit the case, looking for a fresh angle on the mother who murdered her husband, James politely declined their interviews. He felt that the story had been told, and that forcing Chloe to relive it was unnecessary. The family's well-being was more important than sensational headlines. The Smith murder case receded into the annals of local history, overshadowed by new events, until only those directly involved remembered the details. Years might pass, and the scars would remain, but the lesson that shone through was resilience. Chloe had endured the unimaginable, losing her father, suffering abuse at the hands of her mother, then testifying against her in a court of law. Yet she carried on. She lived, studied, and thrived under the kindness of new parents. And in that evolution, there was a quiet triumph. On a cool afternoon some months after the adoption was finalized, Chloe had a school project where she had to bring in a symbol of hope. While many classmates chose things like a candle or a favorite quote, Chloe brought in a small, hand-drawn family portrait. It depicted her father, Carter, with a halo above his head, and James and Diana standing by her side, all of them smiling. There was a sun shining in the corner, rainbow arcs overhead, and a heart shape near the bottom. The teacher asked, "That's a wonderful drawing, Chloe. Can you share why it's your symbol of hope?" Chloe bit her lip, then said in a steady voice, "Because sometimes really bad things happen. But there's always someone out there who cares enough to help you. My dad always told me to never give up hope, and my new parents taught me that love can come from unexpected places." It was a simple explanation, but her classmates nodded, and the teacher smiled, visibly moved. From across the classroom, Brianna offered Chloe a thumbs up. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet affirmation that Chloe's new life had value and she was seen, safe, and loved. Back at home that evening, Diana came across the drawing. She held it in her hands, heart swelling with admiration for the little girl who had come so far. She knew that tragedy and evil could not erase every spark of goodness if someone was willing to fight. And she was grateful she had chosen to fight for Chloe. Even James, who typically maintained a stoic demeanor, felt tears threaten to spill when he saw the picture. He remembered those tense nights spent combing through Carter Smith's records, trying to connect the dots, wishing for a breakthrough. He recalled the moment he found Chloe locked in that bedroom, her face a mask of terror. The memory still haunted him, but the reality now was so different. He saw her laughing, doing homework, calling him dads from time to time. And each time she did, it reminded him that love and courage could mend even the deepest of wounds. When the school year ended, Chloe proudly advanced to the next grade, carrying her improved math skills and a healthy measure of self-esteem. Over the summer, Diana and James planned small getaways. A trip to the beach, a visit to a national park. They didn't have extravagant means, but they saved enough to give Chloe some new, happy memories. She built sandcastles, tried esmores roasted over a campfire, and discovered how huge and star-filled the night sky could be far from city lights. One night, huddled under a shared blanket by the glow of a campfire, Chloe confided to Diana, "I used to think maybe my father was still alive somewhere. That maybe my mother had chased him away, but he was just waiting to come back. Sometimes I get sad that I know for sure he's gone, but at least now I can remember him in a good way, right?" Diana hugged her close, tears glimmering in her own eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. You can. And you can honor him by living a good life, one full of kindness and hope." Chloe nodded, gazing at the bright sparks drifting into the dark sky. Her father would want her to be happy, to find a future beyond the shadow of what had happened. She whispered a soft goodnight to his memory, comforted by Diana's arms around her. As the years progressed, the immediate trauma faded, replaced by the ordinary rhythms of life, school, chores, weekends, and the occasional rebellious teenage mood swings. Chloe grew into a confident young teenager, still cherishing the memory of her father, but also embracing the love of her adoptive parents. Diana continued her tutoring career, but now with an extra spark in her dedication. She never forgot how a seemingly routine tutor session could become a lifeline. James, too, advanced in the police force, earning respect from peers who saw him not only as a reliable officer but also as a father figure who had changed a child's life. Occasionally, Chloe felt pangs of guilt. She'd wonder if she should have spoken up sooner about her mother, or if she should have told someone when Carter first vanished that she suspected something worse than a simple disappearance. But with time, therapy, and the unconditional support around her, she learned to let go of the blame. She was just a child then, overwhelmed by the fear in her own home. What truly mattered was that she survived, and that her father's legacy of kindness carried on through her. When at last the dust fully settled, Chloe stood at the cusp of adolescence with a sense of quiet determination. She wanted to become someone who could help other kids, maybe as a teacher or a counselor. Her experiences had shaped her worldview. She understood the importance of watching for signs of distress and the difference that one caring adult could make. And in the Henderson household, life went on with shared dinners, arguments over who got to pick the movie on a Friday night, laughter when the family dog, a new addition named Lucky, chased its own tail in the living room. There were still tough moments, still some nightmares, still some tears. But there was love, and it was more than enough. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.